The text this morning is Mark 12. It's been a pretty challenging week, so I wasn't able to get the Corinthians study done that I had planned. So we're going to go back and look at this instead. But hopefully we can pick back up with that next week. This parable is a parable about the behavior of the religious leaders and where it's ultimately going to lead in the end. And so what we're going to do, it's a chapter that has parables all the way through it, and it's kind of book-ended. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the first parable, verses 1 through 12, and then we're going to read a couple of verses at the end of the chapter that seem to basically say the same thing, just in a different way. So follow along with me as I read. It says, "And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it, and dug a vat under the winepress and built a tower, and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. And they took him, and they beat him, and they sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent them another slave, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and that one they killed. And so with many others beating, and some killing others. He had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those vine growers said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. They took him, and they killed him, and they threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers and give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read the scripture? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they were seeking to seize him, and yet they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke this parable against them. And so they left him and went away." Now follow along. We're going to jump ahead to verses 38 through 40 and read these two as well. It says, "In his teaching, he was saying, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." Now, the parable of the vine growers is among the easiest to understand of Jesus' parables. It uses imagery that was easily recognized in that day, and this is why it says in verse 12 that they were seeking to seize him, and yet they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke this parable against them. Oh, I guess my clicker's not on. There it is. They understood that this parable was spoken against them. The idea is that the religious leaders may not have been able to discern every detail. They weren't necessarily able to discern everything, but they were able to grasp the broad strokes of what Jesus was saying here. And here's the breakdown for you, just so that we all understand. The man who planted the vineyard in this parable is obviously representing God the Father. And the vineyard itself represented the nation of Israel. And the reason that this was so easy for Jesus' hearers to discern is because this image had already been used by the prophets many times. But one of the clearest examples is in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. So if you guys want to follow along in your Bibles, I'm going to go ahead and read it from my page. And I realized I forgot to tell you this. I did have outlines. Did anyone get the outline? I actually have a whole stack of them in the back. I forgot to hand them out, so oh well. This is Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. "Let me sing now for my beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill. He dug it all around and removed its stones, and planted it with the choicest vine. And he built a tower." It's on that side, sorry. Thank you. "And he planted it with the choicest vine, and he built a tower in the middle of it, and also hewed a wine vat in it." And even as I'm getting to this language here, do you see the similarities between verses 1 and 2 of the parable that I just read? It's talking about building a tower and hewing a wine vat. He then expected it to produce good grapes, but it only produced worthless ones. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So now let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground. I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also charge the clouds to rain no rain on it, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. Thus he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold a cry of distress. And so hopefully what you're able to see there is a clear connection between the nation of Israel and the vineyard imagery that Jesus is bringing out in this parable. Jesus was clearly referring to the nation of Israel in his imagery of a vineyard. And with this in mind, the vine growers who oversaw God's vineyard and abused the representatives that he sent were the religious leaders who misled God's people and used their position for their own advantage. Now, the representatives of the owner that were abused and killed by the vine growers were the Old Testament prophets, who always suffered at the hands of God's people. Jesus famously lamented this in Matthew 23, and so I'm going to put that up there on the board for you now. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. They were always rejecting the prophets, always abusing them. Now, lastly, the son of the owner, who was killed by the vine growers in an attempt to take the vineyard for themselves, was Christ himself. And finally, the destiny of the wicked vine growers represents the looming future for the religious leaders who were shepherding Israel at that time. They would soon be removed and judged for their corruption, was the idea. And with all this in mind, in this parable, Jesus was teaching that God's judgment was at hand for the religious leaders. But the text doesn't stop there. We can also see in verses 38 through 40 that there was a greater and more fearful judgment that is coming for them than for the rest of the world. And follow along with me as I read now. Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive the greater condemnation. So in our text this morning, Jesus is warning of a greater judgment to come for some. And in other words, if I was to put this a little bit more crudely, but maybe in a way that makes sense, Jesus is talking about the hottest place in hell. You know what I'm talking about? You know, that there's a special place in hell for those, you know, that kind of thing. That's what he's talking about here. And for the rest of our time, there are two aspects of this greater judgment that we're going to look at. We're going to look at who it's aimed at, for one, and we're going to look at what it's condemning, who it's aimed at and what it's condemning. Again, this idea of greater judgment, what is it? And hopefully as we unpack these, we're going to be able to see how it applies today. So first, let's look at who it's aimed at. When we look at who it's aimed at, we have to ask the question, when you think of greater judgment, what comes to mind? When you think of, oh, there's a special place in judgment for that kind of person. Generally, we shouldn't be thinking that way, I would argue, but we do, all right? And generally, what comes to mind when we think that way are those people that we despise in the world, whomever they are. And who we tend to despise varies a bit from person to person, but we all struggle with this to some degree. And I'm not saying it's okay to think this way, but we shouldn't think this way. But there's usually a group of people or a category of people that we despise more than others, and those are the people that are going to really get it in the end, that kind of thing. In Jesus' day, people despise tax collectors. They despise prostitutes. They despise Samaritans. We see it in the text over and over again. Today, the world despises based upon differing categories, which reflect politics, you know, those communist Dems or those fascist Republicans, that kind of thing. Or we can go with despise based upon contributions to society or sexual ethics or whatever. If I was to be honest with you, where I struggle the most right now is this is my Wegmans example for the day. There's so many times that I see these poor elderly people that get scammed people will call them and scam them and tell them that they owe money, and they'll trick them into buying thousands of dollars of credit cards and stuff, gift cards and stuff like that, and it's just so vile what they do. My mother was scammed for like $10,000 that way one time. For me, it's very, when my brain goes there, my brain goes to that, and again, it shouldn't, but it does. But whatever the case may be, in our minds, the greatest judgments tend to be reserved for those we despise, all right? And with this in mind, Jesus' parable flips all this on its head by clarifying that those receiving the greatest judgment will not be among those we despise. Rather, it's going to be among those we admire. He's flipping it on its head, and he's saying the ones who are going to really get it are among that category of people that we tend to look up to and admire. In the gospel accounts, we repeatedly see Jesus communing with those that society despised. Again, we saw him constantly communing with those that society despised. We see this in Luke 15, 1 through 2, for example. I'm going to advance a slide in just a second here. It says, "Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him, and both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' And this indicated the favor that those of the world despised had with God at that time and still do today. Jesus tended to hang out with people that the world didn't care for. However, in our text, Jesus clearly warns that those destined for greater judgment will be among those that society tends to hold in high regard. And look again at verse 38. This is the text that we read. I'll read it over and over again. But it says, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive the greater condemnation." Again, those who receive the greatest judgment from God will be among those we respect and admire the most, not among those we despise. That's actually what he's saying there. He's flipping things around his head. You're looking in the wrong place. It's going to be among the people that we admire. And this reality brings two conclusions. First, we need to be discerning, okay? We need to be careful that we are ascribing wisdom and maturity and ability to the correct qualities. People in this world tend to put others on pedestals based upon qualities and characteristics that have nothing to do with Christ or his kingdom or the fruits of the Spirit. It has everything to do with charisma or status or image or such things as that. We tend to elevate based upon that. These have nothing to do with Christ and his kingdom or the fruits of the Spirit. And we see this happening in verses 38 through 40. So I'm going to read the verse again, all right? It says, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief places, seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." The idea here is that the religious leaders oppressed widows and at the same time were admired and respected because of how eloquent their prayers were. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? Have you ever assumed spirituality in a person because of how beautiful they prayed and how eloquent they spoke and how bold they were as they shared their faith with other people and got active in the world? Have you ever assumed spirituality based upon things like that and said, "Oh, I just love to hear them pray, so beautiful," and stuff like that? The religious leaders did that. They were the most beautiful and most eloquent prayers in the world. And people were like, "Oh, they're so spiritual." Well, at the same time, they were doing horrible, evil things to widows and orphans and people in need that no one cared about. So we must be discerning. We must watch for the fruits of the Spirit. We must resist the urge to put people on pedestals because they looked or act so spiritual or because they have such good charisma and status or how useful they might be in this world. But also we see something else. We see that we must not crave the spotlight ourselves. And this is just a shout out, not just to the people in this room, but the people that might watch this online. In this world, there is this a tendency to pursue prominence and respect and fame and such things as that. This is so true in media now. You're trying to get people to click on your videos, you're trying to get people to watch your channel, you're trying to get people to follow you, and you're trying to get famous, and people will do anything, I swear, these days to get that. They will go to whatever ends they need to get more clicks and more interest. But we need to remember that every time we step into a greater place of prominence, where we are naturally more famous or regarded with more admiration and respect, we also step into a place of much greater accountability and potential great judgment. Do you understand what I'm saying? We're chasing after the fame, we're chasing after the prominence, those chief seats and those chief places, and we're not necessarily realizing that that's the place that puts us in the greatest position of accountability before God. So be careful about that. Just watch. And James said this in James chapter 3 when he said, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur stricter judgment." King James says it in a more memorable way to me, where it says, "My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that they shall receive, or that we shall receive, the greater condemnation, the greater judgment." So don't crave the spotlight. God will raise you up if and when you are ready for that kind of a thing. And when he does, approach it with fear and trembling, because you're going to give an account for it. Don't be like the rest of the world trying to chase that spotlight and put themselves in a position where they're going to fall even harder. All right, so that is what it's aimed at. Let's talk now about what it's condemning. And what it's condemning more precisely is it's condemning spiritual hardening, not spiritual ignorance. Spiritual hardening, not spiritual ignorance. And this distinction is important, all right? And I want to just take a moment here and be clear about what we mean by spiritual ignorance versus spiritual hardening so that you understand. Spiritual ignorance is when a person hasn't been exposed to God's light, they haven't seen or heard the truth, thus they live in sin, which is not okay, but they don't know how wrong it is or how to respond. You understand what I'm saying? They're living wrong, but they don't have the truth they need to respond to become right. They don't have the gospel, they don't have the truth. That's ignorance. It's not good, it's a problem. But spiritual hardening is different. It's when a person has been repeatedly exposed to God's light, and despite their clear understanding of God's truth, they choose to reject it anyway. The greater condemnation described by Jesus in our text is clearly a result of spiritual hardening. And in his parable, Jesus describes the vine growers who are repeatedly visited by the owner's representatives and who are repeatedly rejecting them. Do you understand what I'm saying? He's saying you've got these people, he's sending his representatives, they're rejecting him over and over again. These are a picture of people who have been exposed to the light but have hardened themselves against it. And I bring this out for a reason, okay? Because in my experience growing up in the church, I have sensed far more of an interest in believers, or I should say it this way, I've noticed that believers are more energized by spiritual ignorance than spiritual hardening. They're more passionate in general about getting the gospel to people who haven't heard it. And just to be clear, that's something we need to do. I'm not saying it's not important. But I've noticed, and I don't know if you've noticed this as well, but it seems like we're very passionate about getting the gospel out there to people who haven't heard it. And it's a big part of that motivation is saving them from God's judgment to come. But we are far less activated by the even greater condemnation that comes from those who already have God's light but don't live it out. And again, I want to be clear here, spiritual ignorance is a problem. And God has us on this earth to combat spiritual ignorance. We are commissioned to shine God's light to the world around us. However, it is at least equally important, if not more so, that we who possess God's light submit to it, obey it, do it ourselves. We can't take God's light to the lost if we don't live it ourselves. And furthermore, we will be held more accountable than them in the day of judgment because we have the truth and they don't. Those who don't have the truth will be held less accountable in the day of judgment than those who do have the truth. That's what he's saying there. The more truth you have, the more light you have, the more you will be held accountable to respond to it. And the less light they have, the less accountable they will be held. And this is what Luke says in Luke chapter 12, verses 42 through 48. Here's another text that I'm just going to put up on the board for you. I'll read it, but you can follow along. It says, "And the Lord said, then who then is the faithful and sensible steward whom his master will put in charge of his servants to give them their rations at the proper time. Blessed is that slave whom the master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. But if that slave says in his heart, my master will be a long time in coming, and begins to beat the slaves, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. And that slave, listen very carefully in verse 47, who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. For everyone who has will be given much, and much will be required. But to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. All right, so the idea here is that where much is given, much is required. And with this in mind, the greater condemnation that Jesus warns of is in response to spiritual hardening and not spiritual ignorance. Do you follow me? He's warning people that do know better and are doing wrong anyway. And this means two things for us practically. We've already stated them, but I'm going to put them up there in a different way just to summarize for good measure here so we can kind of get this idea in our minds. First, this means that our responsibility to obey what we know is just as important as our responsibility to share it with others. All right? All the time growing up, I was told, share your faith, share your faith, share your faith. We do need to share our faith. But we need to be equally as activated about obeying it and living it ourselves. Sometimes I see even today a willingness to sacrifice and to compromise morally for influence in this world and prominence in this world, and we tell ourselves the whole time, oh, we'll use it to share our faith and get the gospel out there. If we are not actually living the faith ourselves, we would do better just to keep our mouths shut, all right? There's nothing worse than someone who's living like a fool and walking around with a Jesus fish on his car and talking and saying how much he loves Jesus or she. It's not helpful. If we want to be heard and we want to impact people, we need to be living it. And we need to always remember that we make disciples of what we are. All right? We will reproduce spiritually what we are, just like we will reproduce physically what we are. All right? I have 4 children, as you well know. 2 of them are sitting here right now. They are part me and they are part Holly. And 2 of them are more like Holly and 2 of them are more like me. But you reproduce what you are. Spiritually, you do the same thing. If you're a self-righteous jerk, that's probably not that wasn't in my notes, okay? That wasn't in my notes, but it's there. It's in my head. If you're like that, any disciples that you reproduce are going to be the same way, and that's not helpful. Matthew chapter 23, verse 15 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." What is he saying there? He's saying Pharisees reproduce more Pharisees, and they're just as bad and as destructive as the Pharisees that are already in place. So just remember that it's equally as important to obey the truth as is to share the truth. And if we don't obey the truth, all we're doing is hurting the gospel, or we're reproducing more of ourselves. This also means, though, that in the day of judgment, we will be held more accountable for what we do know than the lost will be for what they don't know. And again, this is one of those hard truths that we're going to see played out in the end, because obviously we're trying to get the gospel out there to the whole world. And there is the genuine anxiety that we feel for those who don't have the truth and don't know what they're supposed to do. But the Lord is clear that in the day of judgment, the people who know less will be held less accountable, and the people who know more will be held more accountable. All right? And so for those of us who have been brought up steeped in the truth and shown the gospel, and for those of us who know better, we need to be all the more self-aware that we will be held accountable for what we know and what we do with it, okay? Make sense? We need to, how do I say this here? We need to probably be a little bit less concerned about how God is going to judge them and a little bit more concerned about how we're going to answer for what we do. And if we do that, we're going to be in a lot better spot to be able to help other people as well. Now, in conclusion, I just would I don't want to be, to end this, this study without mentioning again that God kept sending people in the parable. Remember that he sent one prophet out, well, he sent one worker, but they represented the prophets. He sent one, and then they beat him, and they sent another, and they killed him, and they mistreated him. And then you get to this point where he says, I'm going to send my son. Surely they'll listen to him. And as you read the parable, it seems futile. Like, of course they're not going to. They're going to do even worse to him. And they did. But the whole point behind that is just the lengths that the Lord is willing to go to reach us in order to help us to escape judgment. He'll never stop. He's going to continue to reach out, and no matter what the cost, in order to reach us. And we need to be that motivated that same way as we leave this place. Get out there and keep loving on people as much as possible and let nothing get in the way of that. And may the Lord help us to do that.